Sony's console line, the PlayStation, has been one of the most successful console lines ever to exist. Out of their total of 7 consoles, only one of them was a flop, and even then, the Vita sold more units than the Wii U. In total, they've shipped over 600 million consoles over the last 30 years, and I think it's time to take a look at how their first console came to be, why it was so popular, and why it's still brilliant. Our story takes us to 1979 and the invention of the compact disc by Sony and Philips. Ignoring the next 9 years, we can go to 1988, where the Nintendo PlayStation was being developed. CD technology was slowly getting more and more affordable, and 16-bit systems were planning to utilize the vastly expanded storage space. A compact disc can store around 650 megabytes of data, while Super Mario World was made on a half megabyte cartridge. Discs are also way cheaper to manufacture, and as the drives themselves were getting cheaper and cheaper, we started seeing console add-ons like the Sega CD in 1991 and the TurboGrafx-16 CD in 1989. Nintendo wanted in on the fun, and planned to partner with Sony. You see, in mid-1991, Sony showed off their partnership console at the Consumer Electronics Show, but Nintendo ended up stabbing them in the back and partnering with Philips to make the CDI. The reason? Apparently arguments over licensing. In return, we got some pretty good 2000s era YouTube poops, but no actually fun games. Interestingly enough, Sony approached Sega for a partnership as well, but ended up getting ignored completely, with Tom Kalinske, the Sega of America CEO, saying, "That's a stupid idea. Sony doesn't know how to make hardware, they don't know how to make software either. Why would we want to do this?" Of course, Sony was pissed and wanted revenge, and specifically the man who wanted that revenge the most was Ken Kutaragi. You see, in 1989, Nintendo was looking around for some good sound chips for their upcoming console, the SNES, and Kutaragi decided to design the SPC 700 chip in secret. Once Sony found out, most of the executives were not happy in the slightest, but the CEO, Norio Oka, decided to approve it anyways. Even though consoles were still seen as a fad by Sony, and even after the failure of the partnerships, Oga still supported Kutaragi. Working in secret, away from the main Sony headquarters, Kutaragi was scheming to take the world by storm with a PlayStation of his own. Originally, he was unsure if he should target 2D or 3D graphics, but after the success of Virtua Fighter, he decided to go all in on 3D. By the end of it, the PlayStation could only draw polygons on the screen and nothing else. The console was cut down and optimized specifically for what Kutaragi gambled on would be the next big thing. Focusing on pushing as many polygons as possible, the relatively weak CPU was augmented with a powerful geometry transformation engine, along with hardware for video decoding. The extremely forward-thinking architecture ended up working out extremely well for Sony. Even with the 2 downsides of the PlayStation graphics everyone knows and some love. While the CPU could work with decimal numbers, it couldn't do floating points. It didn't have the necessary components. The GPU, however, was the main issue. It couldn't work with decimal numbers at all, causing the wobble that we associate with PS1 games. It could also not do perspective-correct texture mapping. Instead, it used the affine approach, which basically meant that it did not care for the actual depth of the texture it was drawing. So, to it, basically every texture was completely two-dimensional, causing the texture warping that we're all aware of. A third issue was a lack of a Z buffer in hardware, which meant you needed to decide in software what was in front of what, so things weren't drawn in correctly. All of these issues did nothing to stop the explosion of the PlayStation onto the market, terrifying Sega by introducing the history-altering price of $299. The PlayStation burst onto the scene in late 1994 in Japan and 1995 in the West. And what a launch it was! But of course, to have a good launch, you need to have good games. And as Sony lacked any expertise in this department and saw what happened to the Jangier and 3DO, they ended up visiting hundreds of companies to ask for their support. While doing so, they found out how many companies really disliked Nintendo. Companies like Konami, Namco, Williams, and tons of others, over 200 companies in Japan in fact, ended up showing support for Sony and helping to build the massive game lineup the PlayStation was known for. Sony also purchased Psygnosis, a British studio, which not only developed games like Wipeout, but also built a lot of the easy-to-use development kits Sony was known for at the time. Of course, many early PS1 developers, like the ones working on Crash Bandicoot, have described the manuals as requiring debate to figure out what the translated texts really meant, and how many of the libraries Sony built early on were often quite slow. But this was far better than what the other consoles had at the time in terms of dev kits and dev tools, so Sony attracted a huge developer audience. With PlayStations, you could just use a PC to develop games and use a plug-in card, similarly to a modern GPU, and it had an entire PlayStation on it. Furthermore, the use of the C language and a simple GCC compiler further increased the development ease. Kutaragi actually commented himself that the biggest difficulty with developing a console is balancing the performance, cost, and ease of development on it. During its first month in the market, the PlayStation only sold around 300,000 units, over the Saturn's 500,000, and after the May 1995 CES, yes, the $299 one, Sony wowed the international crowds with the new PlayStation. Sega decided to launch early out of fear and killed their reputation with retailers, while the PlayStation launched on September 9th, 1995. And in 2 days, it outsold the Saturn sales in the past 5 months. After blowing the Saturn out of the water, outselling it 3-1 in November, Sony just kept selling more and more units. And that was due to marketing. Sony's marketing was aimed at the demographic of teenagers and adults, because kids looked up to them, and anything that seemed cool and adult was something a typical kid would want to have to seem cool. Sony ended up putting their PlayStations in nightclubs and bars as well, which massively increased the PlayStation's popularity with adults. The console could also be used as a CD player during a time when proper CD players were pretty expensive, which was also a huge boon for those buys. By 1996, Sony was selling over 5 million games per month, to the degree that they needed to expand their CD production facilities to keep up. They could just not keep the shelves stocked. But the Nintendo Ultra 64, later renamed to the Nintendo 64, was launching soon. How would Sony fare? Sales of the PlayStation ended up increasing after the Nintendo 64 launched? Well, presumably because it raised people's awareness of modern game consoles, and when they went into the store, they came out with a PlayStation instead because it was better. By late 1999, Sony held 60% of the North American video game market, and ended up outselling the Nintendo 64 and the Sega Saturn almost 2.5-1. Everyone had a PlayStation, and everyone knew of PlayStation and of Sony. So, once the PlayStation 2 launched, Sony ended up repeating history. But that's for later. Let's talk about the games. The most sold game on the PlayStation was Gran Turismo. Now, Super Mario 64 sold 12 million units. So, it is surprising that Gran Turismo sold a whole 11 million units. This was probably down to console bundles, as no games were bundled with PlayStations, but also shows an interesting split between these two systems. Keep in mind, back then, games cost way less to make than they do today. It's estimated that PlayStation games could cost, on average, $730,000 to make, meaning the average game would need to sell around 20 or 40,000 units depending on the retail price in order to break even. This is of course because we have to include stuff like the printing costs, licensing fees, and such. Anyways, Final Fantasy VII sold around 10 million, Gran Turismo sold 9.3, Final Fantasy sold 8.6, Tekken 3 sold 8.3, you can see all of them here. Interestingly enough, the next game on the list is a Harry Potter game. It's safe to say a lot of PS1 games sold a lot of units. While the Nintendo 64 focused on having a few really good system sellers like Mario, Mario Kart, Zelda, or GoldenEye, the PlayStation ended up having so many system sellers that listing all of them here is impossible. I mean, look at all of them. Furthermore, there are tons of games on the PlayStation that sold just a bit under 1 million units and that aren't included on this list, but let's be real here, there's a ton of them. A big reason for these huge PlayStation disc sales was the price. And not only the price of games, because hey, cartridges could cost up to $90, right? But that's because they cost up to $30 to make. A big 4-CD jewel case for something like Final Fantasy VII would cost upwards of, what, $2 to $3 to make? So, games could be sold new for like $50, $40, even $30 or $20, especially for reprints. So, while the Nintendo 64 was $100 cheaper than the PlayStation at launch, if you wanted to play CDs on it, or owned more than a few games, the Nintendo 64's total price would quickly surpass the PlayStation's, making it the platform of choice for hardcore gamers. The PlayStation was also home to tons of long RPGs and adventure games, as the system could have so much more storage than the Nintendo 64. While loading triggers in some levels were annoying due to the slow disk speed, some games like Crash Bandicoot could just stream data on the fly, allowing for larger levels than what could physically fit in the game's RAM. Overall, the PlayStation won in almost every department except the raw power, and even there it wasn't far off. It had more storage than the Nintendo 64, allowing for larger and longer games to be made with better music. It was also technically better than the Saturn in that regard, because the Saturn's sound chip lacked a specific type of 4:1 audio compression that would essentially quarter the amount of data that the music took up on a console. It was easy to develop for than either of its competitors, especially the Saturn, and due to the developer-friendly tools and due to the developer-friendly contracts, it ended up having a larger market at the beginning, which quickly snowballed into it being one of the best-selling and best overall consoles of all time. It deserved to win. And so it did. And I'd like to thank you for watching. Goodbye.